To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
This is the story of your enslavement, how it came to be, and how you can finally be free. Like all animals, human beings want to dominate and exploit the resources around them. At first, we mostly hunted and fished and ate off the land, but then something magical and terrible happened to our minds. We became, alone among the animals, afraid of death and of future loss. And this was the start of a great tragedy and an even greater possibility. You see, when we become afraid of death, of injury and imprisonment, we become controllable and so valuable in a way that no other resource could ever be. The greatest resource for any human being to control is not natural resources or tools or animals or land, but other human beings. You can frighten an animal because animals are afraid of pain in the moment, but you cannot frighten an animal with a loss of liberty, with torture or imprisonment in the future, because animals have very little sense of tomorrow. You cannot threaten a cow with torture or a sheep with death. You cannot swing a sword at a tree and scream at it to produce more fruit, or hold a burning torch to a field and demand more wheat. You cannot get more eggs by threatening a hen, but you can get a man to give you his eggs by threatening him. This human farming has been the most profitable and destructive occupation throughout history, and it is now reaching its destructive climax.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pax vobis.
Peace be with you.
Human society cannot be rationally understood until it is seen for what it is. A series of farms where human farmers own human livestock.
Next time.
New World Order, Mr. Rothschild?
What?
New World Order? Depopulation?
Oh, listen, who are you...
Genocide?
Who are you televising for?
Well, we're independent
Yeah.
filmmakers. But you have nothing to say, Mr. Rothschild?
Some people get confused because governments provide healthcare and water and education and roads, and thus imagine that there is some benevolence at work. Nothing could be further from the reality. Farmers provide healthcare and irrigation and training to their livestock. Some people get confused because we are allowed certain liberties and thus imagine that our governments protect our freedoms. But farmers plant their crops a certain distance apart to increase their yields and will allow certain animals larger stalls or fields if it means they will produce more meat and milk. In your country, your tax farm, your farmer grants you certain freedoms, not because he cares about your liberties, but because he wants to increase his profits. Are you beginning to see the nature of the cage you were born into? There have been 4 major phases of human farming. The first phase in ancient Egypt was direct and brutal human compulsion. Human bodies were controlled, but the creative productivity of the human mind remained beyond the reach of the whip and the brand and the shackles. Slaves remained woefully underproductive and required enormous resources to control. The second phase was the Roman model, wherein slaves were granted some capacity for freedom, ingenuity, and creativity, which raised their productivity. This increased the wealth of Rome, and thus the tax income of the Roman government, and with this additional wealth, Rome became an empire, destroying the economic freedoms that fed its power, and collapsed. I'm sure that this does not seem entirely unfamiliar.
Glorious news! An axiom!
After the collapse of Rome, the feudal model introduced the concept of livestock ownership and taxation. Instead of being directly owned, peasants farmed land that they could retain as long as they paid off the local warlords. This model eventually broke down due to the continual subdivision of productive land and was destroyed during the enclosure movement when land was consolidated and hundreds of thousands of peasants were kicked off their ancestral lands because new farming techniques made larger farms more productive with fewer people. The increased productivity of the later Middle Ages created the excess food required for the expansion of towns and cities, which in turn gave rise to the modern democratic model of human ownership. As displaced peasants flooded into the cities, a huge stock of cheap human capital became available to the rising industrialists. And the ruling class of human farmers quickly realized that they could make more money by letting their livestock choose their own occupations. Under the democratic model, direct slave ownership has been replaced by the mafia model. The mafia rarely owns businesses directly, but rather sends thugs around once a month to steal from the business owners. You are now allowed to choose your own occupation, which raises your productivity, and thus the taxes you can pay to your masters.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
I don't know what I said.
Your few freedoms are preserved because they are profitable to your owners. The great challenge of the democratic model is that increases in wealth and freedom threaten the farmers. The ruling classes initially profit from a relatively free market in capital and labor, but as their livestock become more used to their freedoms and growing wealth, they begin to question why they need rulers at all. Nobody ever said that human farming was easy.
Obama.
Keeping the taxed livestock securely in the compounds of the ruling classes is a 3-phase process. The first is to indoctrinate the young through government, quote, education. As the wealth of democratic countries grew, government schools were universally inflicted in order to control the thoughts and souls of the livestock. The second phase is to turn citizens against each other through the creation of dependent livestock. It is very difficult to rule human beings directly through force, and where it can be achieved, it remains cripplingly underproductive, as can be seen in North Korea. Human beings do not breed well or produce efficiently in direct captivity. But if human beings believe that they are free, then they will produce much more for their farmers. The best way to maintain this illusion of freedom is to put some of the livestock on the payroll of the farmer. Those cows that become dependent on the existing hierarchy will then attack any other cows who point out the violence, hypocrisy, and immorality of human ownership.
That's all public already. Everything, I worked for, everything that I knew has already been revealed. It's in the hands of journalists. The best part about being sort of a, marked man is that you no longer have to think about tomorrow. Instead, you just live for today.
Freedom is slavery, and slavery is freedom. If you can get the cows to attack each other whenever anybody brings up the reality of their situation, then you don't have to spend nearly as much controlling them directly. Those cows who become dependent upon the stolen largesse of the farmer will violently oppose any questioning of the virtue of human ownership. And the intellectual and artistic classes, always and forever dependent upon the farmers, will say to anyone who demands freedom from ownership, "You will harm your fellow cows." The livestock are thus kept enclosed by shifting the moral responsibility for the destructiveness of the violent system to those who demand real freedom. The third phase is to invent continual external threats so that the frightened livestock cling to the protection of the farmers. This system of human farming is now nearing its end. The terrible tragedies of modern Western economic systems has occurred not in spite of, but because of past economic freedoms. The massive increases in Western wealth throughout the 19th century resulted from economic freedoms. And it was this very increase in wealth that fed the size and power of the state. Whenever the livestock become exponentially more productive, you get a corresponding increase in the number of farmers and their dependents. The growth of the state is always proportional to the preceding economic freedoms. Economic freedoms create wealth, and the wealth attracts more thieves and political parasites, whose greed then destroys the economic freedoms.
That's because we've been focused ever more on our core mission of organizing the world's information, and we are doing it for everyone, and we approach it by applying deep computer science and technical insights to solve problems at scale.
In other words, freedom metastasizes the cancer of the state. The government that starts off the smallest will always end up the largest. This is why there can be no viable and sustainable alternative to a truly free and peaceful society. A society without political rulers, without human ownership, without the violence of taxation and statism. To be truly free is both very easy and very hard. We avoid the horror of our enslavement because it is so painful to see it directly. We dance around the endless violence of our dying system because we fear the attacks of our fellow livestock. But we can only be kept in the cages we refuse to see. Wake up. To see the farm is to leave it.
We, the children of Earth, have a responsibility to develop our own consciousness and understanding to be people of universal peace from this planet. And if we take care of that, the rest will be taken care of.
If you have a golf ball-sized consciousness, when you read a book, you'll have a golf ball-sized understanding. When you look out, a golf ball-sized awareness. And when you wake up in the morning, a golf ball-sized wakefulness. But if you could expand that consciousness, then you read the book, more understanding. You look out, more awareness. And when you wake up, more wakefulness. It's consciousness. And there's an ocean of pure, vibrant consciousness inside each one of us. And it's right at the source and base of mind, right at the source of thought, and it's also at the source of all matter.
On a graph, these phenomena show up as spikes, such as this one. And here is where this all gets very interesting. The date of this spike is September 11th, 2001. Just a coincidence? Well, how about this spike?
Oh my God!
December 26th, 2005. Or this one. April 8th, 2006. In all, dozens of world events, according to project scientists, are linked to the random number generators acting in a very unrandom-like way.
The deepest mystery we can explore is the mystery of consciousness. Do our thoughts and feelings begin and end in our brain? Or are they part of a larger tapestry, one that connects us to everyone and everything in ways we are just beginning to understand?
They're able to actually, for the first time, they're able to actually observe the human relationship between the magnetic fields of the Earth and when we're influencing those fields in very specific ways. Then they went back and looked at the data and said, does this only happen when bad things are present? And the answer was no. Super Bowl Sunday, the whole world is watching, and it's influencing the magnetic fields of the Earth. The funeral of Princess Diana, the whole world came together.
The September 6, 1997 funeral of Princess Diana yielded a major signal in the data. Global compassion following tragedy of major world figures or world loss of life yielded the strongest spikes in the data.
If something like Princess Diana's funeral was bringing 2 billion people to think about the same thing and maybe feel sadness or compassion together, that we should try to see whether our machines, our random event generators, could detect that, could react to it. So in that particular case, I asked all of my colleagues and friends who did the same kind of research, please take data. We had several lines of data in Europe, several lines of data in this country, put them all together, and remarkably enough, or maybe not so surprising if you believe the data from the laboratory experiments, we have a big, strong effect. If you did the same thing 100 times, you wouldn't see the size of change in our REG devices that we saw during the time of the funeral of Princess Diana.
We later had another instance where Princess Diana was killed in a car crash, and her funeral was scheduled a week in advance. So we figured we can use that as another example of lots of attention around the world for one event. And we got, I think, 12 of us around the world got our random number generators going, and we analyzed the result, and again, was significant deviation from randomness towards order during the period of the funeral, when lots of people were watching. And we thought, well, this is great. This is an interesting experiment, but we had to go through a lot of work to get everybody to participate at the same time.
Ever been to a concert or sporting event where the atmosphere was electric, almost like there was something more than just the event going on in the room, something connecting everyone there? Well, there are scientists out there trying to prove what you felt actually was something real. As NBC 11's Garvin Thomas shows us, it's a global experiment taking place in part right here in the Bay Area.
Some of the reality TV programs, believe it or not, the whole world stops what they're doing. They want to see who the bachelor chooses as his bride because they love a love story, you know. But the point is, it doesn't take something bad, it's something big. And when many people can come together, tuning their hearts through what we would call positive emotions of care, gratitude, appreciation, we create a collective field that is scientifically documented now.
The thinking is, there is something which connects all our minds, a global consciousness, if you will. And on 9/11, for example, instead of everyone concentrating on different or random things, we all focused on the same thing. That non-random pattern in the global consciousness is then somehow registered by the eggs.
The next step, though, is the one that people mostly question. Because if inside our heads we are exploiting that gap, it means that we have quantum development in the system which takes us to a level somewhat beyond present technology in our experiments. The experiments still support quantum mechanics, and we have not yet seen where something new has to come in. But there are good reasons, in my opinion, when we look at going back to these two major revolutions of 20th century physics, quantum mechanics on the one hand, Einstein's theory of general relativity, space-time is not flat, it's curved, gravity is not a force, it's somehow a curvature. There is something quite different from other kinds of physics going on there. If you bring these two great theories together, we see this conflict suggests strongly that there must be a change in the rules of quantum mechanics at a certain level. And that certain level is not too unreasonable that it should be relevant in the brain.
Oh, by the way, the reason we did this is because we knew that events would occur that we couldn't predict, and that would attract a lot of attention. We wanted to see what would happen under those cases.
I think we are destined to either become this layer of intelligence for the Earth, collaborating to do the job that we are best fit to do, which is monitor and enable and protect the Earth, which is the home we have, the only home.
The Global Consciousness Network has scientific data showing similar responses to many world events, such as Earth Day and World Healing events. Major earthquakes reflect in the data hours in advance of the actual earthquakes, showing that the global consciousness field is not limited to what human beings directly perceive.
This one of now over 200 such events. Things like gigantic tsunamis, earthquakes, political events, the death of celebrities, unexpected things. Those kind of events go into our database. And what we do then is we have this ongoing, continuous random stream from around the world. We have a formal way of saying, well, this event is either predicted or an event occurs, and we go back later and we analyze the result through a standard method that we use. And we can see whether this worldwide random system is behaving randomly or not. And when you look at composite over the 200-some events, the odds against chance are over 1,000,000 to 1 now.
Organizers say, however, the GCP is not about predicting the future. It is about understanding ourselves and our world. Because the project is still in the early stages, they say they will need much more data and many more world-changing events before they reach any mind-changing conclusions.
So we have good statistical reasons to believe that the random generators are not behaving randomly when there are large-scale events that attract a lot of attention. At this point, we don't know then which direction the arrow of causation goes. We don't know whether it's simply a lot of human minds that are somehow changing randomness, or whether this is a reflection of something bigger, something like a collective mind, of which the collective mind attends to something, and collective mind includes everything else, including what we think of as matter and energy. And so the attention, the change that we see in randomness may be the same in some way. It's the same kind of organizing event that changes random events. It also changes our attention. But again, I don't know which direction the arrow of causation goes, and maybe it's so complex there is no single arrow. Maybe some giant system of some type.
To be a field where people are less aggressive, more willing to cooperate to solve their problems, and if we were ever going to do that at a time on the planet, I think right now is a really good time to do that.
Because there is this resonant effect through the force, if you want to look at it that way, through this entangled, interwoven consciousness field.
We are all one. We're one. Diversity up here, unity down below.
And so I encourage you to bring your heart into coherency as many times as you can in a day, and to bring coherency to your life and to all the people around you that way, because you influence them through the fields. We know now that we're all connected and that you influence everything around you and outside everywhere in the universe as a whole. So as much as you can go into coherency and bring that space of coherence and love and understanding and joy and empathy for the world, you're making a huge difference.
Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!